Greetings, everybody. My name is Sagnik Ghosh. We will be continuing on the topic of systems today. We'll be looking at them in a more detailed way at some of their aspects. And before we move forward, I would like to mention that in my previous videos of the Y project on our YouTube channel, I had mentioned that we would be covering some TOK aspects of systems. However, this may be due to my own negligence or due to my lack of knowledge. I couldn't find any concrete TOK evidences, TOK links with which I could connect. I couldn't find any connection with systems, no concrete connections with systems and TOK. I'm sure if you try hard enough, you'll find something or the other. But I have found something which may be more relevant to you all, rather than just having some theory of knowledge applications. I'm sure maybe that is an exercise to the reader, as they say in maths textbooks. All right, enough of small talk. Let's start with our actual agenda today. So, today we'll be looking at how systems are affected. So, how are systems actually affected? Basically, what I want to say by this is if I poke a system, what will happen to it? If I were to poke a system or if I were to pull it, something like that, what would happen? Let's look at that. So I would like to show you this video of the motion of a simple pendulum. Okay. So you see at this point, there is no force other than gravitational force acting upon this pendulum. What I mean by that is the force that is acting, the force that is acting on this pendulum is only gravity. There is no other force that acts on it. Only its weight is being pulled downward by gravity. So it only has gravitational potential energy at this moment. Only gravity is acting upon it. It's the same thing as saying if you are standing on some, if you're just standing regularly on a plane surface, on a surface which is 180, which has zero irregularities, you can say, or which is more or less even, does not have any angle to it. That is basically the same thing that is, and you would be experiencing on that plane surface, you are yourself experiencing only gravitational potential energy, force, nothing else. The same thing here. Okay. Now, what happens if I take this and displace it to some place here or here? Let's see. You see, it is being displaced now. So if I had considered this place, this when it was just here, if I considered this to be a balanced position where its only force is gravitational potential force that is acting upon it, so gravitational potential energy that this pendulum has, then let's consider this to be a balanced state for this system. We can consider this whole thing to be a system, and we can consider this to be the balance within a system. Okay. Now let's see what happens if I move it to this place, or in physical terms, if I displace it. Okay. It's oscillating. It's moving back and forth. See, the to and from motion of a simple pendulum is called the oscillatory motion. Anyways, that is a physical thing. But what I want to tell you through this is, if I move the pendulum to this place, if I displace it here, if I consider, if you can draw an imaginary line here, I'll just use the laser pointer. If you can think of a imaginary line here, then this side you can consider to be the positive axis, and this side you can consider to be the negative axis. So if I move it towards the positive axis, the pendulum, you will always notice that the pendulum, wherever it is being displaced, in whichever direction, be it positive or negative, you'll always notice that it is, when you let it go, it always accelerates towards in the direction opposite of the displacement. What I mean by that is, if I move it to this side, it will always move in this side when you let it go. See? And this keeps continuing. So initially what happened here was I had moved the pendulum to here in the negative direction, but it always moves in the opposite direction to that. Always. So, in whichever direction I put it, displace it, it'll always move in the opposite direction to that. And what happens is, the interesting thing is, it keeps oscillating until it reaches O here, or the mean position, or the equilibrium, what we consider to be. So, this resistive force, we can say it to be this force that accelerates it towards in the opposite direction of the displacement, will eventually excuse me, it eventually wants this pendulum to be in balance, or at this position here, since there is no since this is just a simulation, it isn't moving back to the equilibrium, but in a real life scenario you would see that if you were to displace it, it would ultimately come back into the main into the equilibrium position. So okay, all that is fine, but what does that have to do with systems exactly? Well, I'll show you. Now I would like to introduce the concept of negative feedback loops. All right, now let's look at the definition first. Resistance to any change from balance in a system, okay, the counteraction of any deviation from the equilibrium of a system, these two mean the same thing. Now this is exactly what had happened in the pendulum example that I had used. So basically the pendulum system is resisting any change that I give to it. What I mean by that is, if I displace it in the negative direction, it will always try to come back into the, if I displace it in whichever direction which is not the equilibrium position, it will always try to come back to the equilibrium position. So it always wants to come back to that balanced state. And this phenomenon is basically the negative feedback loop. So this resistive force that we see, that is the negative feedback loop in the system. So you can just read this paragraph here, but essentially that is what I mean to say, right? And this negative feedback loop is seen almost in so many places. You will understand it's almost astounding in how many places negative feedback loops are, maybe in concept or in actual practicality. I'll just show you some examples. The negative feedback loop in prey-predator relationships. How does that work? Let's go through this diagram first. So here are some birds. These are northern pin-tailed ducks. These are common pochards and common coots. This is a Eurasian marsh harrier, eagle, whatever. I mean, they're just birds. So this is the prey. Sorry, this is the predator. I'm so sorry. This is the prey, and due to the prey, the predators are attracted. So of course they will feed on this. Now, due to the predators, the prey population decreases. Okay. So the prey population decreases. How? So that means if the prey population decreases, predators don't have enough of their food supply to sustain how they were living before. Thus, their demand reduces for this, and due to lack of food, they also perish. Few of the predators perish. So due to this perishing of the predators, the prey population increases because there are lower predators, and the cycle repeats. So if I consider this to be the equilibrium of the system, wherein sort of they are proportional, where let's say there are two, let's say the ratio of balance is 2 raptors is to 50 ducks. So if that is the balance, then the system is again naturally going back to that balance here, if you see. So that is the negative feedback loop in prey-predator relationships, and this happens in almost every natural system. If you look at the relationship between the tiger populations and the deer populations, they're the same thing. I would like to give you one example. In Sariska National Park in Rajasthan, there was a period wherein tigers were not actually there inside the park. They were poached, and like their population had completely reduced. So due to that reason, their competitors, the leopards, they had increased. Their population had increased a lot, because usually leopards are wary of tigers in the forest because they know that the tiger is more superior to them. So so the leopards thought that they were the boss of the jungle. However, when the tigers were reintroduced, the leopard population decreased once again. So that is the balance that the system got in. That is due to the presence of the tiger that the system got balanced again. So that is the negative feedback loop essentially. So I just like to repeat this once again. Prey attract predators attracted to prey. The prey population decreases. Due to this, the predators also decrease in population. But now the prey population increases because there is a lower risk of predation, and the cycle. And now this means that the predators are once again attracted to the prey because their population has increased, and thus the cycle repeats once again. Now let's look at another example. This is the example in terms of the water cycle. So increased sunlight intensity. Okay, there is a lot of sun. You'll notice in summers when there is too much sunlight for a long period of time, it is almost always followed by rain. It is because of this reason. Increased sunlight intensity. This evaporates more water from water bodies, which forms clouds as it condenses when it goes up into the atmosphere, because the upper atmosphere is cooler. It condenses, it forms the clouds. This causes rainfall. Then the clouds get cleared, and then again the sun appears, which repeats the cycle, right? So this is another negative feedback loop. Always there is that balance in the system. So if something is too hot, if something becomes too hot in the system, well, the rain happens and it cools the temperature down. Then now it becomes too wet. It is too wet due to, let's say, there is too much excessive rainfall. Now it becomes too wet. That causes a sunlight intensity that causes the clearing of clouds, and then the sunlight intensity increases. Of course, this applies to certain geographical regions. Of course, it may not apply in Scandinavian countries when there are 6 months, when there is 6 months of sunlight, 6 months of darkness. Of course, that is not what I mean. But in concept, you will see how the negative feedback loop works. Essentially, it is when something goes out of balance, negative feedback loops always try very hard to put it back into balance in terms of system. Okay, now there is a negative feedback loop. There's another thing. So first I would like to tell you about this example. High levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere cause global temperatures to increase. All right, fair enough. Increasing temperatures cause permafrost to thaw. Permafrost is essentially dead animal and plant matter which had been frozen for a very long time due to the presence of ice in the polar regions. And due to the lower temperatures, they always remained frozen. But now, due to the increased temperatures, that ice starts to melt, which causes this dead plant and animal matter to be exposed to the environment. Now, due to this, as organic matter decays, it releases CO2 and sometimes methane into the atmosphere. So now let me repeat the cycle. Due to global warming, the temperatures increase. It causes that frozen dead plant and animal matter to get exposed, which causes CO2 and methane to be released into the atmosphere, as we all know, CO2 and methane are greenhouse gases, which again contribute to global temperature increases. Now this is different from the negative feedback loop. If you can see, something that had caused this the phenomenon, which are global greenhouse gases, the phenomenon which had caused this action to take place, the global warming, that is again produced in this cycle itself, which is again taken back into the system and which again repeats the cycle. That might all seem in the air right now, but let me just explain it very quickly for you all. So this is a positive feedback loop. The amplification of any deviation from equilibrium in a system. One change which sets the system out of balance leads to many more changes which all set the system out of balance. Okay? Now you can read this paragraph here. It is essentially what I had talked about in the previous slide. This is another very good example. Birds and population. More population causes more birds, which increases population, which causes people to reproduce more, and that cycle repeats on and on. A change such as the births of individuals leads to a higher population, which leads to more birds. Same thing. So this is what I was trying to explain in the first slide. So the input here if we talk about the first example, the input in that system of the global warming, in the first example which I took of the positive feedback loops, so the input are the greenhouse gases which cause global warming. Now it's inputted into the system, um, or more specifically, actually, the increased temperature. The input is the increased temperature due to greenhouse gases. Into the system, it is inputted that melts all the ice from the permafrost, which causes more methane to be released, and that output is again fed back into the system. Now, this being fed back into the system is almost analogous to being the input. If something is being fed back into the system to produce an output, that something is always the input, right? So that output is again greenhouse gases, which causes global warming, and then is again fed back into the system, and that's the cycle keeps repeating. You see, these are quite dangerous. These things, positive feedback loops, are quite self-repeating. They keep happening unless there is a um, external force which sort of halts it. And to compare it with positive feedback loops, if we look at the pendulum example, essentially what happens is, in a pendulum, the change is always tried to be counteracted. The change is always counteracted. However, in terms of a positive feedback loop, that change, if I do this, that change would be magnified, let's say 10 times, and that magnification keeps happening until it reaches some very high point. Of course, that is another discussion, but that is how the positive feedback loops work. In simple words, one change causes another change, which causes another change and another change, ultimately leading to the first change, which repeats the cycle all over. Okay, now something very interesting. Let's look at Let's look at the real life applications of positive and negative feedback loops. Let's talk about bang bang control, a self-regulated negative feedback loop. What does that mean? Well, you'll see when you're turning on the AC or when you're turning on the heater. Let's talk about the AC now because there is a thermostat attached to it. If I turn the AC on and I set it to 28 degrees Celsius, and after a point of time, you'll see that the AC just like stops working. Of course, not stops working. What I mean to say is it sort of, the sound which you hear, like its machine doesn't run, its compressor doesn't run, it doesn't run at that much efficiency. Not efficiency, let me find a better word for this. Actually, what I mean to say, it sort of holds down. Its cooling effect is sort of reduced. And you'll notice that the biggest indicator is the sound drop. It keeps, there is a sound which the AC creates when it's operating at full efficiency, but then you'll see there is a subdued noise when it reaches a point. But why does that happen? What I mean to say is, when the temperature drops to a predetermined low set point, the thermostat switches the heating system on. When the temperature reaches a predetermined high set point, the thermostat switches the heating system off. This is talking it in this example is speaking in terms of heat. But if I were to look at cooling, then that's the same thing. At 28 degrees, if I set my thermostat to 28 degrees Celsius, after a point of time, the AC sort of halts its progress. What does that mean? Actually, what it means is the AC turns off by themselves when they detect that the room temperature has reached the thermostat temperature. The AC turns on when the room temperature exceeds that of the thermostat temperature. The AC attempts to keep the room temperature at the thermostat temperature most of the time. So do you see a pattern here? Whenever the temperature is not at the thermostat temperature, the AC will always have some sort of countermeasure to make it reach that thermostat temperature. Always. So the AC attempts to keep the room temperature at the thermostat temperature most of the time. We can consider this temperature to be the equilibrium in our system, and the negative feedback mechanism is the bang bang control, right? And this works in terms of heaters too. Let's say there's a heater which has a which has a thermostat, and once the room temperature is set to that heating to that temperature, the heater stops operating, for it halts in its progress. But when the temperature decreases again, it again sort of pushes back that temperature up to that level. And that is essentially the concept of the bang bang control. And this is the self-regulated negative feedback loop that is operational in on our ACs and cooling systems or heating systems. Now, what do you do with this knowledge? This is actually quite an interesting thing. If we set our air conditioner to 16 degrees Celsius in a 40 degrees Celsius room, the air conditioner is likely to run continuously for many hours, since it takes very long for the room to get cooled down to 16 degrees Celsius from 40 degrees Celsius. However, to decrease our electricity bill, more power consumption due to longer hours of the AC running requires more electricity, which increases the bill. We can set our AC's temperature closer to the room temperature, let's say about 24 degrees Celsius. It is still much lower. It is almost half of 40 degrees Celsius, but it is much closer to 40 degrees Celsius as compared to 16 degrees Celsius. Why does that matter? Well, because your AC won't have to run for as long to reach 24 degrees Celsius as it would have to reach 16 degrees Celsius. This is due to the feedback mechanism, negative feedback mechanism. Your AC won't stop operating until it reaches this 16 degrees Celsius predetermined by the thermostat. It won't stop operating until that time. And that time required is very long, which increases our electricity bill, which is definitely not something we would want. So you know the reason. So now you know the reason why we should keep our temperatures which are closer to the room temperature rather than keeping it at some very low temperature, which will cause the AC to run for an extended period of time. Alright, let's look at something else. Positive and negative feedback loops are literally everywhere. Now, why I'm saying this, you'll very much understand now. Positive feedback loops are the reason for population growth, as we had discussed in the previous example. Now, this applies for trees as well. Trees and any population growth. If there are more trees then they will pollinate more compared to one single tree, and thus the tree population will rise very much. All the population increases follow negative feedback loop, positive feedback loop. Right, more birds, more population, and that cycle keeps repeating. However, there's a catch here. Population fluctuations in the long run, they always operate in negative feedback loops. Now, why is that? You see, there is something known as carrying capacity of the environment or the ecosystem. What that means is carrying capacity is the level to which is the maximum level at which the system can sustainably support its inhabitants with all its resources and all without being overexploited. And after that carrying capacity has been reached, let's say it has been breached, the carrying capacity has been broken, and now the population size increases above the carrying capacity. Many people will die because they won't have the resources necessary to live sustainably. That is exactly what happens in natural systems too. So you see here, tree establishment and growth. A small seed turns into a plant which goes to a tree, and then it pollinates, which causes more plants to be seeded, and that process continues. However, you see here, population size has a limit to it. So once that limit has been breached of so many tree populations that the forest cannot sustainably live, and the tree populations will not be able to sustainably handle themselves, because that might be due to lack of water resources, or that might be due to lack of sunlight. So once that population size has been reached, once it has been breached the carrying capacity, the tree populations, many of the trees will start to die off because they don't have the adequate resources to live sustainably, and that causes the population size to decrease once again. So if you see that graph, it's like this, keeps increasing, but then it decreases. It decreases because the population size is now lower, because it had reached the carrying capacity, right? However, it again increases after a point of time because there are much lower trees everywhere, and that reduces competition among the trees, and that means one tree can get much more resources as compared to 10 trees, and that causes more trees to grow, more pollination to happen, and that cycle repeats. So you see, this is a negative feedback loop. the negative feedback loop is that it is always attempting to keep the tree populations under this carrying capacity. So it should never be breached. It is there is always so the tree populations essentially shouldn't be too much out of control. It should essentially if the tree population reaches here at this point, which is above the carrying capacity, that means the tree populations are out of hand, out of control. They need to be reduced. So that reducing measure is the negative feedback loop, which causes the tree populations to reduce again, and the cycle repeats. Okay, that's another ecological example. But now I would like to bring in an economics example. I'm sure we all must have seen this chart we must have seen. This is known as the cycle of poverty. Let's just go through it once. There's a poor household. There's little food, unclean water, and no school. There are diseases, infections, and no energy to work because of the aforementioned reasons. Causes low productivity, low or no income, low self-esteem, no personal control, leads to drug abuse, and that causes high childbirths because of the uneducated background, sick elderly, and more dependents, and that cycle repeats. So you see, that's a repeating cycle. This is essentially a positive feedback loop. Whatever comes out in the output is essentially the input. So the output of the system is fed back into the system, and the cycle keeps repeating. So more so the higher number of poor households, the more this thing happens, and that cycle of poverty keeps running on in the generations. It doesn't stop unless there are external factors to deal with it. But considering no external factors, the positive feedback loops continue on and on. That is an economics example. Now let's look at a political example. Okay. Feedback loops are analogous to political systems. We can consider democracy to be a negative feedback loop. So in a democracy, one person cannot have too much power. There is always a counteracting force that keeps them balanced. When something goes out of balance, democratic measures put them under balance once again. Let me give you an example. A leader is here. He abuses power by doing something. This is reported on the media, and he comes under heavy criticism. This causes that leader to resign. A new leader is elected. The leader, considering the leader is corrupt again, the cycle repeats until a non-corrupt leader is found. So you see, the democratic system always aims to keep the system in balance. One person cannot have too much power. It should all usually be equal. So the negative feedback here is the leader is always tried to be kept at a non-corrupt stance. The leader should always be non-corrupt. So once it is corrupt, that means there is something. Once the leader abuses his or her power, that means there is something out of balance in the system, which is rectified through the negative feedback loop. Okay, that's fine. How about a positive feedback loop in terms of political systems? A dictatorship. A dictator has power, all right. The dictator persuades more people, gains considerable amounts of followers. People who are not following the dictator's ideology are converted to followers through the bandwagon effect. Bandwagon effect is a behavior which is displayed by the masses, which is sort of imbibed by people who are not following that ideology. So basically the majority converts the minority into the majority, into themselves. So the dictator has power, dictator persuades more people, gains considerable amounts of followers, and then there are more followers created, and that means he has more power, and the cycle repeats. So again, the same concept. The output is fed back into the input in the system, and it keeps repeating. So one change has power, leads to more changes, which comes back to the same point all over again. So the dictator keeps increasing in terms of power. Okay, and that is all for this episode, or not episode, but for this session. I hope you have learned something valuable out of this lesson, and I hope you can look at systems in a multidisciplinary approach. not just from ecology or biology or physics. And I'm sure it will aid in your explanations when you're trying to explain something, and that person can understand it from many, many different angles. Thank you.